What's going on, everyone? So I am here to talk about the 1K tournament yesterday from Madison, Wisconsin on Take the Initiative's channel. For those of you that are not subscribed, you definitely should head over there and check it out if you're interested in competitive Star Wars Unlimited, or if you just want to hear the breakdowns, I guess you could stay here. But I'll leave a link to their channel down below in the live stream because I watched the full 9-hour stream. Well, most of it anyways. There's a lot of breaks and such. We're going to break down the top 8 and the winner deck, which was Han Blue. Took down the entire tournament. And you guys have already heard me sing the praises of Han Blue. I have been very excited about New Han since, well, New Han was initially released. I called it the best leader from set 2 by a large margin, and it seems to just continuously impress. And honestly, I don't think that I was incorrect in that judgment. I want to talk about a few things before we dive into the actual deck lists in terms of tournaments and how it actually went on, and in terms of like how the players ended up performing and all that stuff. I have a few things to mention, and then we're going to dive into the top 8 lists themselves. Quick mention, big thank you to my Patreons. We've been chatting a lot on the Discord, and I've been chatting a lot about decks and such. Anyways, I wanted to say, to start us off here, I was watching through, as I said, all of the rounds leading up to the top 8 and the top 8 itself. And nothing wrong with the broadcast or anything like that. And I think the overall tournament was run amazingly. These guys do events over, I've seen Tabletop Simulator, I've seen the paper events, and they run really well. More on the actual mechanical and gameplay side of things. In the rounds leading up, I saw several plays that were just mechanically misplayed. And I don't mean like, okay, you should have attacked here and you attacked there and this is the result of that, or you shouldn't do that in this matchup. Nothing like that. Nothing like overall strategy, but like things that were, oh, I play a Bazine and I make you discard, but then you don't draw a card. Those types of errors. And I did see a good chunk of those types of errors. I think I saw the Bazine one specifically like 4 times. So when I'm watching this as someone who is interested in the competitive aspect of Star Wars Unlimited, and I see some of these mechanical issues, I am very kind of wary of determining, okay, these are like the hot decks. This is going to be amazing. Like if you see, we do have one of them in the top 8 that was a little bit surprising and outside of the normal meta. Well, that might just be because, you know, we had a few players entering in the tournament that weren't necessarily extremely competitive oriented. Whereas if you're watching like a Pro Tour from Magic the Gathering, you don't really see any of those types of misplays because they are all like multi-tournament winning professionals. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this. Not to say that this is any like less important than any other 1K cash tournaments, because of the most competitive events that we have right now in Star Wars Unlimited. Just something that I wanted to mention because it was something on my mind going through it. And I'm not calling out any player in specific. These guys played for like 9 hours straight, and they're in the thick of things, forgetting a trigger. You know, it happens to everyone. It's just something that, you know, doesn't happen when you're considering like extremely high level professional play nearly as much as it did on this one. With that said, Han Blue took down the entire tournament, and this is the exact list. I will leave a link to all of these lists down below and kind of the placement that they got. But overall, this is an extremely amazing list. Han Blue has something that really no other deck has, and that is just the absolute consistency of one less cost units along the curve. Having that ability alongside arguably some of the most powerful colors to back it up, or aspects to back it up, is extremely gross. One of the reasons why we're playing Han Green and like kind of that mid-rangey ramp style of deck was to ramp, right? But you already are ramping in Han Blue, and Han Blue gets you access to 3 extremely crucial cards. The first one being Luke Skywalker. Okay, this card is absolutely amazing. It really helps you kind of close the gap in terms of, okay, they still have this out where if I don't restore enough, they could still ECL out a wrecker or something and destroy me. because of that last bit of damage. That Restore 3 really helps alongside the removal aspect. The second card being Chewbacca. Okay, Chewbacca is absolutely insane. Not only can you just play him for 7 resources in this deck, but you could also smuggle him out for 9, which is pretty cool. But this thing will come down as a 6/8, which is a way better stat line than a 4/10, to be honest, while also killing something. And again, that can come down after Luke. You can go Luke into Chewbacca. So you kill something, and you're really, really far ahead. And you also have Redemption. Now, this is actually something interesting because I played a lot of Han Blue myself. And one of the big differences is they kind of cut a lot of the earlier drops. Like all the drops here, Cassian, Yoda, the K2s, the Kanan, or Kanans, and all this stuff I pretty much had in the deck. But the big and major difference is they kind of cut, copy of Kanan, copy of Obi-Wan. They dropped in a couple of Mace Windows and they went, higher on the top end, especially with the triple copy of Redemption. Now, I completely agree with this decision, especially with where the meta was in this top 8. Redemption is just one of those cards that really lets you completely shut out the game for your opponent. If you're on like 21 HP on your base, there is still a way your opponent can win. For causes, getting a space unit and you just don't happen to have the cards to deal with it, even though you have a lot of ways to deal with things like that in this deck. Redemption allows you to just heal up that 8 points of damage if you choose to do so, or even less than that if they have like a wing leader or whatever that you want to maybe stay out of range for, so you heal like 6 points of damage. But that brings you down from like 21 points of damage on your base down to 15, 14, 13 damage, and that is extremely, extremely relevant. And we saw Redemption be absolutely game-changing in multiple parts of this tournament. And I think this is an amazing, amazing adaptation towards where the meta was headed. And again, we even saw this in the final matchup, because the final matchup, which we'll go over the second deck in just a moment, was the Sabine Green versus Han Blue. And one of the reasons why this is Han Blue favored is because of all the restoring. Yoda, Kanan, you have things like Obi-Wan as Sentinels, Luke as more restore, but then you just kind of close out the game, and their finishers are also removals while also healing you. Luke, Redemption, these things are really tough for Sabine to kind of come back from. They really need to close out the game in the first, 5-6 turns of the game. But this was pretty sweet, and I do think Han Blue is starting to shape up as, like, by far the best set 2 deck. In terms of what I've seen overall. This is a deck that I've been playing for, well, basically since before set 2 released. I've been playing Han Blue, Han Green, Han Red. I had better results with Han Green in terms of what I tested, but Han Blue, I think based on where the meta has headed, as I've played more, I've actually had better results with Han Blue. And so this makes 100% sense to me. And as we talk more about the top 8, well, you'll start to see Han Blue appear a couple more times. Okay. Second deck we're going to talk about is, well, the finals match, which was the Sabine ECL here. Now, this is a pretty stock list, I would say. Same with the Han Blue, to be fair, but pretty standard Sabine Green list. But there are a few kind of crucial parts of this that I do want to mention. First things first, ECL. We got to talk about this probably the most out of the entire part of the deck, because there are different ways that people play ECL. One of the key plays that I saw in game 1 of the finals matchup was we had our opponent, or the Han Blue player, played a Sabine Red on turn 1. And our play as the Sabine Green player was also Sabine Red. Like, that was the choice we had, right? And if you kind of know what Sabine Green or Sabine Red does, is she attacks as a 2/3, but then also is able to deal 1 damage to the defender or the base. And this allows you to essentially kill your opponent's Sabine Wren and keep yours around. And so as a result, the Sabine Green player ECL'd out Sabine Wren on turn 1. So it was a turn 1 ECL that kept their Sabine alive, and it killed the enemy's Sabine Wren unit. This, to me, is not something that I would ever do in Sabine Green, with very few exceptions. So I guess I shouldn't say ever, because I do it very, very sparingly, but it's not something I would have done in this matchup. To me, ECL is exclusive to 3 cards in the deck, and that is K2, Poe Dameron, and Wrecker. I think all 3 of these have very viable options. The one that I least to do is K2, but I do Poe Dameron very frequently because it comes down, it can kill things like Boba and Liv, it can kill other 5-drop leaders, and Wrecker is the one that I want to use it on the most because, again, ECLing out Wrecker will oftentimes kill an opponent's unit while also dealing, well, anywhere from like 4 to 6 damage to an opponent's base. And again, all we're trying to do is get into our opponent's base. So to me, if they had not used that ECL, maybe that would have been a worse play. I don't know how the game would have ended up going out or, following in terms of what the game would have shaped up to be. But it did limit their options severely, especially against Han Blue, because Han Blue has the perfect stat line for a 6 damage Wrecker. Your opponent flips Han, he has a 3/6, you ECL Wrecker, you deal 5 to Han, you ambush it, and boom, you hit their base for 6, and you're left over with a Wrecker with 3 points of damage on it, which is extremely tough to deal with. Now, yes, they can still Luke Skywalker and all that stuff, but you've dealt 6 damage to your opponent's base, which is really, really critical. Again, this is a card that, depending on the matchup, will win you and lose you games based on how you use it. This is the deck that is essential for ECL, and this is the deck that also reflects how well you perform with ECL in terms of your results, because this is probably the most important card of the deck alongside the Wreckers and Poes, because that's what cards you're really using with it. On another note, a couple of cards that are a little bit different in this list than what I'm used to potentially seeing. Sundari Peacekeepers, some lists run 0 of these. They're not a rebel unit, but it is a really nice option against the Sabine Wren Mirror, well, and also just good against some of the more aggro/tempo style of decks. For example, if your opponent plays a Crafty Smuggler on turn 1 as a Boba Yellow player, Sundari Peacekeeper actually does pretty nice against that. And it also restores 2, which is good against Boba Yellow. That's the type of scenario. I'm not saying that Boba Yellow is like the matchup for Sundari Peacekeeper. Normally it's the Sabine Green matchup, but this restore 2 can help. It's just a little bit of a different kind of take on the list. The other thing that I wanted to mention is the timely interventions. Some lists are running very few of these, and some lists are running the full playset. To me, I am the type of player that leans towards the full playset, as ECL, as I mentioned earlier, is one of, if not the most important card in your deck alongside the Wreckers and Poes, and the ability to potentially ECL or ambush out another Wrecker or another Poe can help you come back in that middle stage of the game. And if you've built your deck pretty consistent and maybe trim on some of the other events like Heroic Sacrifice, Heroic Resolve, then you really mitigate the downside of having time intervention in your deck. On that note, there's a couple other cards that I did want to talk about with Sabine Green, and that was Heroic Resolve and Darksaber. Darksaber is one of those cards that really, really wrecks a game very quickly if your opponent has very few answers to it. The answers that you're going to want to be afraid of are things like Entrenched, things like Power of the Dark Side usually, things like the Rival's Fall. Those are the types of cards that can immediately deal with it, or things like Disabling Fangfighter, things that can defeat any sort of upgrade. Those are the cards that you have to be afraid of. But when you're fighting against Han Blue, in terms of main deck, now their opponent did actually have 2 Disabling Fangfighters in the main deck. But this is a card that Han Blue does, in some cases, have trouble dealing with, and is a way you can get in some massive amounts of damage very early on. Now, some decks, Darksaber's godly in. Like, for example, if you're fighting against another Sabine Green, Darksaber could be really oppressive in that matchup in terms of just getting in the most amount of damage possible and pumping up your other units. That could be really disgusting if you happen to have like a Sabine Wren out or a Sundari Peacekeeper, for example. And then in other matchups that, does have Rival's Fall or has like a lot of Sentinels or whatever it is that they're doing that messes with Darksaber, well, you're obviously going to be a little bit worse off. Along that note, Heroic Resolve, I found to be pretty unimpressive. I personally have been really, really on the side of not playing as many Heroic Resolves and just going back to Heroic Sacrifice. There are some situations where Heroic Resolve is really good. Again, if you are fighting those Sentinels, you can go ahead and defeat Heroic Resolve and give that Overwhelm, which is really the case that I've seen Heroic Resolve be pretty good. But overall, I've just been a lot less impressed with Heroic Resolve than I initially thought I would be. And generally speaking, I just like Heroic Sacrifice a little bit more. Other than that, another card that I do want to mention is Spec Force Soldier. This card goes up as more Sentinels are being played, and Han Blue really relies on an Obi-Wan on turn 5, or turn 4 rather, to Sentinel up something and then flip Han to give the experience tokens to Han when Obi inevitably dies. So that's something to consider. You know, removing that Sentinel is quite important. Just something to keep in mind for these Han green decks. Those are the final matchups. We're going to talk a lot less about the other decks because some of them are just repeating. And, well, that was the finals, which we got to see the full 3 games. And next we're going to talk about is, well, guess what? Another Sabine Green list. Who would have thought, huh? Who would have thought? And as you can see, we have all the decks here up top. But Sabine Green, this is a little bit of a different list. One thing you'll notice, no Spec Force soldiers in the main deck. I think that did hurt in some cases. They're not running the Sundari Peacekeepers. They have a couple more 3-drops, Fighters for Freedom, Fleet Lieutenants. They have Echoes main deck. And in terms of events, they are playing the full 3 of Time Intervention, but they have no Heroic Sacrifices. They're running the Daring Raids, and they have the second copy of Darksaber. So first things first, Echo. I've played a lot with Echo. I thought he was going to be a really powerful addition. Here's the thing with Echo is because of like K2SO, for example, if you have the option of multiple 4-drops, you really just want to be going with K2 basically every time, even if you can get the effect from Echo. And oftentimes with Sabine Green nowadays, you actually can burn through a lot of the cards in your hand pretty quickly. And there's not many times when you actually will give the 2 experience tokens to a unit, as you need to have played a unit, have it survive, and then play Echo, and then give the 2 experience tokens to either, well, that unit that you've already played or Echo himself by discarding a second Echo. But this list runs only 2 Echoes, which makes that line a little bit worse. And he's only a 6/6, which can be dealt with things like Power of the Dark Side. Heck, I've seen people play Poe Dameron, right, on this turn. So it's not really all that scary anymore to play a 6/6 on turn 3. But Echo, not a huge fan of. Me personally, I would definitely not run him in Sabine Green. I don't think he really fits that style of deck, but I don't think he's terrible by any means. The other card, Daring Raid, I have very varying results on Daring Raid. There are some decks that I think this card's really good in. For example, the Kylo decks, the decks that you're really trying to burn out your opponents, the Ray decks where you're able to combo with Tarkin Town. I think that's a really nice addition, right? Giving you essentially a 1 resource 5 damage event on any unit that's non-leader is pretty strong. Those are the types of situations where I've been finding Daring Raid pretty good. Not in Sabine Green, so I would have not played the full 3 of. I do like the full 3 of Time Interventions with Poes, Wreckers, etc. And I do actually like the second Darksaber. I've been back and forth on Darksaber. I had tried a more Mandalorian heavy version with the Sundari Peacekeepers, Ketsu Onyos, and things like that. I landed on 2 Darksabers, and I also like an Inspiring Mentor, because that can kind of take the place of Darksaber when you want to go in on pumping up your Sabine a little bit, but not all the way in. And you can follow it up with a 2-drop, for example. Another, I guess you could say, interesting decision about the list is only 2 wing leaders. I usually see the full 3 of every single time. So seeing 2 of them is a little bit interesting. And of course, the no Spec Force soldiers, which I think you should always run like 1, as some situations that is the key to winning. But of course, it really depends on the matchup. Next one, and this is a little bit of a spicy one, as I was talking about earlier, was Cad Red. Now, I don't think Cad Red is very good at all. And if you're looking at this, you're like, dang, Cad Red is doing it. I don't know if you should really be going all in on Cad Red. And to be honest, I'm a little bit surprised at the direction of this list, right? Because one of the things that I thought I would see for sure with a Cad Bane Red list was Triple Dark Raid. And you can see in the events, we have no Triple Dark Raid. And yet we are playing Ruthless Raiders, Xanadu Bloods, right? And those cards are awesome off Triple Dark Raid. Now, that's not saying that this is enough vehicles to make Triple Dark Raid work. I'm just surprised that I didn't see it, as I would have expected Triple Dark Raid in a yellow-red based deck, just like Boba Red, for example. Now, in terms of what we're doing with this deck, we are kind of just a curve out mid-range style of deck. I'm closer to aggro, to be honest, kind of like Sabine Green, where you're trying to just kind of curve out and also have a little bit more mid-rangey threats. That's where Poe Dameron and Wrecker come in, and that's where Ruthless Raider and Xanadu Blood come in for Cad Bane. Couple of things. This is kind of like a standard Boba Yellow curve when it comes starts off at 2 resource. We have Bazina Talls, Cloud Riders, Dr. Evazons, Inda Boba Fett's, and Toro Calicans, Forlom, Zuckai, Gamorrean Guards, and Bosks. These are all pretty standard stuff that you'd see from Boba Yellow, and there's a reason why Boba Yellow can play some really solid games. That's because even in a deck like Cad Red, where you have options for red cards, you're not really playing them. In terms of 1-drops that you might not be seeing, Lady Proxima and Guavian Antagonizer. I'm a little bit surprised about the Guavian Antagonizer, but we are a much more aggressive style of deck. And it is an Underworld card, which can trigger Cad Bane if you're interested in doing that. Although basically every single card is Underworld. In fact, I don't actually know. Well, I guess the Ruthless Raider, the TIE Silencer, No Good to Me Dead, Surprise Strike, Relentless Pursuit, and Hot Shot Blaster are the only non-Underworld cards. And Toro. So pretty slim in terms of non-Underworld cards. So you're going to get that trigger pretty frequently. But I guess another 1-drop helps us use our resources at awkward turns. And Lady Proxima usually is responsible for like gaining 3 or 4 HP because your opponent has to attack this if they choose to do so. And also dealing 3 to 4 damage because you're playing all these Underworld cards. Pretty sweet list, to be honest. If I was going to build this, I would definitely put the Triple Dark Raid in the deck and lean towards a more vehicle-oriented strategy, as I think Ruthless Raider and Xanadu Blood off of Triple Dark Raid is quite strong, but that's just kind of what I found to be pretty strong. Really cool seeing Cad Red in the top 8, though. I've been really impressed with Cad Bane as a set 2 leader in general. There's just a couple of cards that makes Cad Bane really sad. Fortunately, they didn't see too many of them in the top 8 because it was mostly Han Blues and Sabine Greens. But a card like Lurking TIE Phantom just completely shuts down Cad Bane's ability because you can just, as an opponent, target your own TIE Phantom with that ability and it does 0 damage, which is really unfortunate. Next one we got to talk about is a Kira Green. Now, this is a non-ECL Kira and a pretty interesting one. A little bit different than what we're typically used to seeing with Woo's list. That one kind of is, I guess you could say, a little bit more towards less controlling, where this one's running things like Child Sins, another copy of Super, nope, not another copy of Super Laser Blast. The copies of Entrench, that's what it was. Just in general, it seemed a little bit more controlling, like a little bit more slower. Not that much more, but you're still kind of following the same mid-range curve where you're going like Hylobot Enforcer Shield, Pike Sentinel Shield, whatever you want to do. Death Troopers, deal some damage, Super Laser Tech, and resupply to ramp into Kira or Snokes or Mauls or Darth Vaders. Smuggling Outlaw Pikes. This is a pretty standard Kira Green list for the most part. This is what I would consider a soft control list. The idea behind it is you're just playing these high value units and then you're getting rid of your opponent's high value units because you have the choice, right? You get to play things like Hylobot Enforcer and suddenly you have a 3-2 shielded on turn 1, which kills your opponent's unit and keeps this around. And eventually it trades evenly in cards, right? But your opponent has to invest more time and energy into them killing the Hylobot Enforcer than you do with their units, which is really, really important. That's all what the deck's trying to do, is just play high value units. Pike Sentinel, take initiative, put a shield token on it, and then suddenly it's extremely obnoxious for your opponent to deal with. Heck, you can even finish off their unit with a Death Trooper potentially afterwards. This is really powerful. The card that I've found to be the most impressive in this list, at least for me, has really been a card like Overwhelming Barrage or even a card like Snoke. And the reason being is that if you time your Kira flip properly, those cards can just absolutely decimate you and you cannot recover. Heck, if you are playing things that have 4 toughness and you're trying to like flood the board, for example, Overwhelming Barrage is going to wipe those out after you've flipped Kira. Or eventually Snoke's going to get rid of them with that -2/-2, which could be pretty impactful as well. This is definitely, I think, the biggest, I don't want to say sleeper, but I felt like it was one of the big sleepers from the earlier stages of set 1, where no one was, or early stages of set 2, where no one was really on to Kira. Like, people were on to New Han immediately. People were talking about Cad Bane, people were talking about Bossk and all this stuff, but no one was really talking about Kira, and some people just thought she was unplayable to bad. But this is definitely a pretty strong list. In our next one, how many more do we got? We got 3 more, including this one, another Han Blue list. This one, as you can see here, does go back down to the 2 redemptions and does have the Concord Dawn interceptors, which is really quite interesting. Alongside that, we did go up to the full 3 of well, Obi-Wans, but we completely dropped Kanan's, which is something that's also a little bit interesting. Overall, this is a pretty standard Han Blue list, as I talked about earlier. Not really anything too crazy to talk about, I guess, in terms of what this list provides you versus the other list that we talked about earlier. You're going to get a little bit more Space Sentinel, a little bit more space pressure avoided, and you're going to get a better kind of Obi-Wan setup more frequently. But you're not going to have Kanan, and I really, really think that that is a card that you really want to be playing in Han Blues, mainly because you can get him down turn 2, and in some matchups, that extra storing throughout the entire game can be really, really impactful. Next one is a double yellow Han list, which is a little bit different than what we talked about, right? We talked about some dupe lists, but double yellow Han is not a dupe list, but it is a list that people were claiming as the strongest list in the entire game. Now, I personally am not there. I do think this list is pretty good and definitely one of the top decks in the meta. I would definitely put it either top of A tier or like S tier level, but I don't think it is the best deck in the format. And we really did see Han, the OG Han, perform nearly as well as I would have expected in this tournament. That said, this list is still extremely strong, and you still are running arguably the most potent combo in all of Star Wars Unlimited, which is the Han Solo DJ Tech combo, where you're able to steal an opponent's resource permanently, which is extremely, extremely powerful. One of the big things with Han Yellow, I will say, is this is one of the most tricky lists to play. Not just Han Yellow necessarily, but also like Boba Yellow, for example. And Boba Yellow might even have more things to think about. I know some people see these lists, they're like, dang, you're just playing the meta decks. Of course, it's going to be easy. But to me, these tempo double yellow lists are the decks that you have to think about the most, right? The Cantina Bouncers being played in their specific scenarios. The Kiras being played in the specific scenarios. The Bodhis being played in the specific scenarios to disrupt your opponent's hand. Then putting on the pressure and things like that. While also, in Han's case, knowing when to use your action to exchange those cards in your hand for immediate value. And in Boba's case, knowing how to sequence your plays in order to get most value from your leader's action. These are the things that differentiate people who are just trying out Han Yellow and Boba Yellow and people who have been playing it for a while. And in some cases, there are a lot of lines with Han Yellow, especially with tech being something that you could smuggle, something DJ is something that you could be smuggling, L3 something you could be smuggling, your Hotshot Blaster is something you could be smuggling. And remember, you can be putting cards into your resource pile with Han's action, and you don't have to defeat those ones that you put in your resource pile from your hand. So you can smuggle those out, which is something that a lot of people don't recognize. But I think the biggest mistake with this deck is people tend to lean heavy on this disruption without actually putting on pressure. If you're doing 2 to 3 damage in every single turn, you started off with that type of pressure, you can get away with disrupting your opponent a lot. But if you go Spark Rebellion turn 1, and I've talked about this a lot because this is something that comes up in my videos, you are on the back foot immediately, because that is something that I do not care to see or care about, really, because you are the one that's supposed to be putting on pressure, and all you're doing is kind of both stalling out, which is really good for you. So just something to keep in mind. One other thing about this deck, and we didn't really get to see too much of Han Yellow in terms of watching it on camera, but the DJ Tech combo is something that in some matchups is going to be absolutely amazing, and in some matchups it's going to be kind of whatever to kind of mediocre. Know what matchups those are. Things like the soft control, hard control matchups, you can usually do some good work with the DJ Tech combo. Not always, but most of the time. Your ramp matchups, of course, like Palpatine double green, your DJ Tech can be really powerful. Know when this is going to be really impactful, disrupting your opponent's process, and know when it's going to be something that is, well, not necessarily worth going for. If your opponent kills your DJ before you end that turn, they're going to get the resource back, and you went through that whole combo for not too much value. So just keep that in mind. Lastly, we have another dupe Han Blue list. This one's a lot different. To be honest, this one's the most different out of all of the Han Blue lists that I've seen in a little while. The cards that I want to call out, first one, we have Queel here in the 2-drop slot. Now, I personally am partial to Queel. I don't actually think he's like insane in Han Blue necessarily. I actually just prefer oftentimes running all 3 drops, but I do think Queel is pretty good. And I do think this is a card that if you end up showing up with this card against like Boba Yellow or Sabine Green in particular, you can actually do some major work because they oftentimes have a stat line that actually can do some that Queel can do some work against. Crafty Smuggler, you know, you can attack it twice and Queel trades with it while also drawing you cards, restoring you. Greedos, that also works if you're fighting against Sabine Wren. You can attack it twice, or your opponent at least has to attack Queel once. And that is really good for you because you're not taking damage on your base, right? So just something to keep in mind. Alongside that, we actually have 2 copies of Poe, or 1 copy of Poe and 1 copy of Rey versus the full 3 of. Now, most lists are running full 3 of Poe Damerons and 2 to 3 of Reys. Or in some cases, 2 Poe Damerons, 2 Reys, 2 Poe Damerons, 3 Reys, that type of scenario. This list is all the way down to 2 5-drops. I personally find this to be a huge liability in the deck. One of the big things about Han Blue is that you want to be playing powerful things on every stage of the curve while also taking advantage of your discount every single turn. And not having that critical mass of 5 resource plays, I think really hurts the deck. Now, I can't verify that necessarily in terms of, you know, how this deck performed with those 5-drops / not having enough 5-drops, because it ended up getting into the top 8. And I've always tried to lean towards more 5-drops. I've not tested it with only playing 2 5-drops, but that's just something that I wanted to mention. Back down to the 2 Obi-Wans, but we're still back up to the 3 Lukes, 2 Mace Windu's, 2 Chewbacca's, 2 Krayt Dragons, which is pretty standard. 0 redemptions. I think that hurt a good amount against all the Sabine Greens coming around. And also another pretty interesting couple of cards. We have 3 copies of Covert Strength and 3 copies of Jedi Lightsaber. Jedi Lightsaber is an interesting choice, especially with only having 1 Rey. But they have the triple Kanan and triple Yodas, which both work really well with Jedi Lightsaber. And sometimes you just play it on like a Queel and you get a 5/6, and it's like, dang, that thing is kind of nasty and it's just going to kill all your units. So that can come into play. Covert Strength works well with this strategy of trying to take advantage of Jedi Lightsaber. Now, I personally, in the event category, have found things like Pillage and Karabast to be better than the Jedi Lightsaber Covert Strength combination, especially Karabast. I think Karabast is a little bit underrated right now. Don't even have it in the sideboard for this deck, but something to consider. Karabast acts sort of like a removal spell or removal event in this deck, so that's pretty awesome with Han Blue. Overall, guys, that's going to be the complete breakdown. I'll leave all the links down below, the Take the Initiative stream, all the deck links and everything like that if you want to check it out yourself. The closing thoughts on this is Star Wars Unlimited is all over the place. I think the meta is kind of just flowing on whatever flavor of the month it is. And I don't mean that like critiquing the players or anything like that, but if you see a deck and you play with it and you're like, dang, this deck's really strong, that's just kind of the deck that people are bringing. And you could see this reflected over the course of basically all of the meta so far. If you look at like other TCGs, I'm going to compare this to Magic because that's most commonly, you know, what I'm familiar with in terms of watching a lot of these pro tours and a lot of the, more recent tournaments. You're going to see these meta shakeups not really happen all that often, with the exception of the sets actually being released. So I expected a shakeup with set 2 and maybe a little bit more as we go deeper into the format. But it seems like every week we're seeing a different number 1 deck, right? We're not seeing like a massive percentage of players play a certain deck and have higher win rates or whatever. Initially it was, okay, Boba Yellow, disgusting. Next it was Sabine Green, guys, don't forget about her, she's insane. But also Han Yellow, ridiculous. Next it was, you know, oh my gosh, Hondo Blue and Kira Green, soft controls back, baby. And now it's back to like Han and Han Blue specifically. It's pretty crazy in terms of what we're going through. We're still seeing the regular contenders, but we saw 0 Boba Yellows and 0 Han Greens, which is another deck that a lot of people were excited about. OG Han Green, that is, when we were initially talking about set 2 meta. So just keep your eyes on the lookout when we're considering all of these tournaments and where the meta is. Overall, what I would rank the decks is kind of where I think the decks will place, and based on the small tournaments that we're getting, we see somewhat of a reflection of the meta. But remember, these tournaments, I think this one's like 43 players, so a good showing, but not anything that we're seeing where hundreds, thousands of professional players are playing in one situation. That said, we do see some clear favorites, and Han Blue has continuously popped up. Kira Green has continuously popped up. Han Yellow has continuously popped up. Sabine Green has continuously popped up. And those are things worth mentioning. And that's why I think that Han Blue is definitely creeping up there as one of the best decks in the format, especially where the meta has shaken up to at this point. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed, and I will see you all for a video soon.